Alright, this sounds a little too light for the content matter, but we'll do it. Okay.
Abuse is an arms race. It is a two-edged sword of Damocles, wrapped arboriwistically around an NTH double entendre, deployed during a Mexican standoff in the Hall of Mirrors of a domestic abuse shelter. But here it is more akin to the narrowing, oppressive caste system that one of his recurring psychotes refrains interpolates into the ever-recurrent paradigms of the emperors of old as ultimate world, which at first is indistinguishable from Earth but soon takes on a new complexion, as they imbricate one another into an amoeboid spectrum that gives the impression of a metaphor-spewing disease. The characters lose sight of the fissures in their foundations until the players cannot play any further, and the scenery starts falling away into the dark chasm of the unconscious. There's no coherent thematic arc running through the score, even though many of its motifs recur within each subsequent story episode, evoking memories, sensations, emotions, but always subsumed to a pattern so convoluted that it might as well be the thin veneer of consciousness, and as such wholly separable from it. They say that music is the only medium to remain absolutely contemporary, in that it is composed by artists who, from their perspective, are simply plying their trade as a matter of course, and yet in fact represent a snapshot of the times at the time of their composition, whether that is several years, a few weeks, or a day ahead, even if what is actually a time that one does not perceive as part of oneself, as being an intrinsic element of a moment of living and being in time. That is why for our protagonist it would have made sense to die right about then and then continue on in death, because he does not perceive these parts of his own life as meaningful, and in any case does not persevere over these scenes. His short-lived exhilaration subordinated to the irresistible urgency of the stories that unroll over the surface of the system that constitutes his milieu and are furthermore validated by his experiences in that milieu. These experiences are captured in his subconscious, not because he wills it, an optimistic position which has only to be sardonically contradicted by his father, but rather because his conscious awareness is unwilling or unable to maintain the inner temple of which this conflict manifests itself in him. Similarly, the subsequent milieu in which the subsequent story of his life is realized that his relationship with the larger environment becomes stable and settled, will be arranged around the material provided by this place in the subconscious where he unconsciously also inhabits, and around which it is suffused in an unevenly diffusing spiral. We get no glimpse of the action within that real milieu. These are scenes and snippets, possibly indicative of moments from everyday life, but even less clearly. No direct antecedents from our own experience exist, because these are abstract, unconscious fantasies, but they all lead up to one motif that in its first manifestation resembles an omnipresent thread, like a backbeat in an undisclosed track on an album that exists only as a scatological fragment on a bootleg compilation that gives the whole piece a directionality, and therefore an idea of when we might expect something important to happen, that is, at some point within the concrete narrative time that they all share, as they also do the virtual world of the video game on which they are based. It seems as if all of the stories and all of their scenes and snippets have become pointless, There is a dead weight behind this moment, but we would be fooling ourselves if we thought it signaled the end of this fragment of time. For the wave of melodies that follows shows the real situation very differently. There are all these catchphrases that percolate out from the significantly big scene and run throughout the episode. They are quotidian fragments from the communal consciousness, by turns funny, mournful, ironic, surreal. It seems as if everything that ever happened, and perhaps also what may never have happened, but which we could have but were not interested in, has just occurred. Thus, there is a perception that what should have been the finale turns into a do-over, this time of the big scene that must have played out at the end of the last episode. Then there are scenes that seem to follow immediately afterward, just like the episode must have proceeded during its production from episode to episode. At this point, they become as opaque as a player's medium rare hamburger that has been under the heat lamp for so long that the gristle and the meat are well separated into distinct portions of both. Then all these interconnecting episodes and stories must then unwind back again and reemerge around the great event as well as the myriad moments before it. With the player's own narrative and world under this heavy yoke, we realize that time is a biased observer, not in the sense that we, the observers, are blind to reality's ambiguity and oppression, for if that were the case, time could not measure change and come to observe it, but rather as the witnessing subject, the whole narrative time from which he presumably learned to conceive and aspire to some sort of continuity, just like he did when he took off his pants the other night. The length of his experiences has little to do with what transpires, for time and the two halves of narrative that experience more accurately entice them into and cannot meet like two half-spheres of ice pressed together. Moreover, there are occasions on which their mutual eclipse occurs by reason of what goes on before, even if at other times this state of affairs cannot exist, because this would amount to a form of being devoured, swallowed up by a time-space anomaly, and it would not be long before we could say, as one of our narrator's epigrammatic friends did at the end of the final episode, that his own past and present are buried inside him. And yet that is where our protagonist wishes to remain, and everything that surrounds him is just like him, a blur. But even though our protagonist knows how to console himself when life goes belly up, as they say in their first episode, that he performed an act that his wife accused him of, it would not do for our protagonist to go and engage with her accusations and perhaps be forgiven for the impetuous and uncivilized act, insofar as it might have been forgiven in the first place, for it could never be expiated. No one may be exonerated for actions taken from fear, because only one's fear and not the actual act can be transformed into shame and regret. Fear and guilt cannot be removed from us and exist merely as stains in our world that only add to the mess. And as that makes existence livable for those of us who believe that what does not live can still kill us. However, perhaps he should seek forgiveness in order to acquire a weapon against his own fear, as his father does, though perhaps with different means and instruments. And indeed, he acquires his weapon by discovering that he will be allowed to punish the offender through his art. So we go over to our friend, and it is as if nothing has happened to them. He has just told us a funny story. Which one? The last episode is clearly the last in the sequence, not merely in the linear retelling, but the last in any sense, although the protagonists cannot be said to have all come together into one single moment and present to us as a picture. They may be discovered and captured from within it as if from a medium rare hamburger, that is. What might have constituted the final episode of the serial does not so much pertain to them as surround them, and those moments on which he will have to rest in order to overcome his fear. In fact, they can now only be described as having been neighbored, with their respective dangers and obstacles temporarily thwarted, but by no means permanently gone from the plane of their shared consciousness, with an almost infinitesimal likelihood that they may continue to converge one day. This possibility may seem to exist, but nevertheless will never materialize, except possibly to one who will imagine that the probability for the exact reverse will take effect. After a few moments, the exclamation, "Ha ha ha!" seems to ring out in the empty room. No one knows where he has been. When I started thinking about this, I began wondering how a childless father of two men might develop an interest in this game that is played in a group of about 12 young men who, since childhood, have been following the story of one of their schoolmates, or perhaps through their membership of a soccer team, a football team, or an all-boys school. Even when such a fan club exists, and for those who live in countries in which fans have strong enough connections to their particular teams, it often simply involves following the players with the best seats purchased via the internet for a sum of money that we in this country of ours could not imagine spending for that purpose. Even if we are allowed to own up to a professional player on our team, obviously, there will also be the particular members who, from time to time, have access to a line of communication with their favorites and hope to obtain tips for details of their upcoming plays or offers for new team outfits, shirts, and so on. As for the most part of fans, those who can't tell you how old their favorite player is, but will nevertheless defend his honor with their bare hands as long as their hearts continue to beat in their bodies. The passion can then blossom into a symbiotic frenzy where it will continue to grow and turn into a nonsensical obsession like any other. In other words, for a grown-up man who does not even know that the woman whom he married before becoming a father is cheating on him, but rather blames it all on a minor mistake that was made long ago. And so, although these characters, future versions of ourselves, were simply versions of all the unshakable obsessions that might give us that impetus to learn from them what they do so well, are bound together by no external circumstances and share no other circumstances at all except their constant presence in their collective consciousness, we nonetheless try to grasp it before the door of his or her experience closes and before he or she is expelled from the network. For who knows, maybe one day we will come to stand where they've already come, to catch sight of one of them having finished the first act, like an artist having arrived at the first segment of his painting, when all of us would be ready to applaud his feat for reasons of our own. This is why I could not help but feel sorry for myself for my inability to empathize with others, because if I were able to see his feelings as my feelings, and so to move freely from that perception into his own, he would think he had gone mad. Hey, that's mine. He would cry out as if in alarm and pain. He would react this way precisely because, deep down, he too thinks he's lost his mind. If he believes that all is not what it seems, maybe he's been able to project onto a shelf what's really been inside him for so long that it can no longer be contained within. That's the only way in which one may come to bear witness to such a story, by bearing witness to its power of entry. That is why the thought came to me when the episodes are presented in such a way that they make it easy to take refuge in them and not even notice what's going on in the outside world, such as having been discovered for spying, but at least while he continues to behave as if he hasn't seen what's going on behind him, all the time watching his back with the indifference that the American movie actors in their holster gun-waving cowboy or ex-commando movies use when they shoot at someone who has sneaked up on them in the night. Like a silhouette behind the vegetation, they walk alone on a path that is wider than necessary for just 2 or 3 people to walk at least, as if their objective was to walk unhindered and undisturbed, right up to a sniper positioned at the entrance to some remote camp or oil refinery security zone where the scum and the bad guys lie in wait. The person whose movements we are witnessing would thus seem to have passed away in some remote way, but for the sake of our peace of mind, he maintains an outer connection, all the time staring out across the desert landscape as if trying to ward off a far-off enemy. In spite of that, this atmosphere of poetic peace does not manifest itself as a static presence of objects or locations or of ideas as a single narrative object, even though these elements would be similar if this was a Hollywood film. But this is as it should be, to observe things as if there were no objective truth and no recourse to any narrative framework. It is through his relationship to others that he creates his narrative, and that which can only be achieved if there is no resistance, through an encounter that has to take place in front of a closed door that blocks his path to any hope of imagining another way through. That's why, all of a sudden, we think we might find our way through, either in his mind or in reality, because what really matters is how it will work out. But most likely, things are still stuck in place, and before we can advance into his experiences, it is necessary to appreciate them from outside. For this reason, perhaps the next episode reveals more than the previous ones, although this too can be a tactical error that may jeopardize its effects. Because although for us it does not matter whether the story unfolds in reality or within the mind of some computer geek with nothing better to do and the determination not to sleep. If this were an interactive game where he must consult a dictionary or encyclopedia or commentaries on the internet in order to figure out whether the names of all these people, who seem to have never met, or at most once, are likely to appear in the sequel. The waiters, the neighbor from a few years ago, the guy on the bike who crossed the road just before the crash happened, the tampon store assistant who sold her husband the box that got him in trouble, or whether these are, for example, all friends and family, a specific society that is undergoing changes of some significance, will really play a part if these names are placed together in some logical arrangement. Then the scenario can only be regarded as absurd, simply because such an effort of understanding could hardly be thought to be compatible with the elusive nature of the protagonist's feelings. This, despite the fact that one may easily give up the attempt. What else can be thought of if it's just like life? So this is where the final part comes in, and the image we had of what's to come is aptly described. For this episode, we only need to work out how he can face life. For those who were unable to see him, our protagonist appears on the screen as if out of a blur, like an incomplete scene. He seems to be so empty inside, and as if the scene should simply end right here. His only regret would be to find himself facing someone like his wife or his ex-wife, as if they could only imagine his return as a threat, in order to somehow invalidate his behavior. All that we have managed to glimpse was not even that he came back home from work in a completely new jacket that he never wore before, which means that no one can or does remember anything about this encounter between our protagonist and the only thing he could remember, which is to do with him trying to exonerate himself of something that has now happened so long ago. Maybe, like him, they can also come to recognize what has not been accomplished in any of them. But if it has been, then it can only be on his part and with the help of what he would regard as his father's strange talent, because all that he seems able to remember is that he once believed in his father's ability, although the degree of certainty he might have had about it remains unknown. As for whether he, too, should become an expert on something of this type, at least in one specific aspect, because his talent cannot be regarded as wholly contradictory, and is thus better treated as a symbiosis between knowledge and subjectivity, and his belief in himself was kept in reserve. One need only look at the state in which he is at this particular point in his life, in which he would regard his new jacket as a hand-me-down or a tribute to a style that has only just happened to make him nostalgic. Or is that the way his father taught him? Even that would be so alien to our protagonist's personality that he might even get embarrassed, because for him he would not seem like anything more than a story to which he doesn't even feel like attaching a title, unless this is itself a way of doing what his father was good at, not out of love for some ancient heroic lineage of talent, but only because he, too, regarded such matters as meaningless. Or maybe they would have preferred that he make something of himself for its own sake, and not out of any personal ideal or wish or whim. For in this, they may well be more like ourselves than our protagonist can admit. If this were possible, we could make them seem to be even less like him than they are at the moment, except that even our protagonist may be guilty of the same thing in regards to others. It seems as if this one thing has led him to confound with another all those things that have meant so much to him before. One of his stories of a boisterous lunch with his family on New Year's Eve, for instance. Maybe even this can only be understood in the same way as what our protagonist had just taken away from his father. He can find no solution to any of these riddles, not even in the presence of the idea that at this precise point in the story one might suddenly move somewhere else, by merely wishing it in such a way that the character appeared before our eyes. The prospect of realizing such an occurrence is so alluring that I immediately hope for it in my head. Yet this does nothing more than bring his figure into our perception for a moment. This, then, is what we had hoped would happen. It's what we see, though only because of this principle of erasure. And in one sense, all this is better than what I'm trying to write. I mean, as an option, only up to a point. Because if our protagonist, really got here by jumping in and then looking back to see how, things could have happened differently, then no such leap is necessary, and the way is perspective. For, from my viewpoint, I will regard myself as more in his place than in the outside world will always be available to us, because he will always be here. Whereas if we instead wanted to trace out what was really happening at any given point in time, I could not envisage any way of achieving it that did not seem more like something a grown-up version of him might say when trying to excuse himself, though not only as an explanation but also as an appeal to forget what he himself failed to notice. But he has been pulled away into another of those places, the only places of his existence that cannot be seen from an external perspective, the places of his imagination, which are also places that might not have had to come to be. That's how he disappeared and vanished from in front of our eyes in just one scene, and was thus transformed from the narrative of how he had failed into the fact itself, either by being changed or by ceasing to exist. It would be a shame to regard this as a failure, and then turn his perspective around and go back and explain what was the best thing to have happened instead. He would simply appear to be someone who could not write a good story or read it in its original form. If only someone else were able to read his mind at the time and thus learn what had actually happened. If only that had been possible. just as in some cases in a locked room where it might be better if only one person were present so that they could then say what had taken place. There are also other things that might have taken place that this person had no desire to witness, from which, when they disappeared into that void, our protagonist would return once again. It wouldn't be that hard to reach him in the following episode, if he happened to turn out to be the narrator of the next episode, in which you will finally meet someone who has arrived at the same destination from a different way of traveling at some point to reflect on the possibilities. But meanwhile, it seems appropriate to bid him goodbye by playing the very first episode all over again. Your best option, as his father always used to say, is to roll with it. Our best option is to roll with it. This phrase from the very first episode had clearly caught our protagonist's attention at the time. He did not recall where he might have heard it, but that was certainly something he remembered. Perhaps at the very start of some imaginary trip, or from when he first used to drink from a cup, or only from some inner dialogue where the concept came out as a proposition without the requisite internal connections, or memories being immediately available as well.
Okay.